Good evening. We're so glad to have all of you here, that you were brave enough to not mind the snow and travel the roads to get here, and we're happy to have you with us this evening. My name is Lucy Wilkins. I'm the site manager educator for Lee Chapel, and we are very excited about having Dr. Hopkins here to speak on this particular topic. His lecture tonight is based on his book, Robert E. Lee in War and Peace, the photographic history of a Confederate and American icon. And Margaret would never forgive me if I didn't tell you we have some books for sale afterwards out in the foyer, and Dr. Hopkins is going to sign some of them for you if you like. Before I introduce Dr. Hopkins, I'd like to thank the Friends of Preston Library, represented here by Don Samdahl. They really helped to make this event possible. The Friends of Leyburn Library also got on the bandwagon and helped us by providing refreshments. And Tom Camden's team in Special Collections has put together a rather amazing collection exhibit of the Lee photographs that we have in the W&L collection. So if you haven't had a chance to look around outside, you certainly want to do that after the lecture. And Tom also wanted me to be sure to invite you into the Special Collections reading room after the lecture, where you can see some of the original Lee documents that we have. So if you've never seen Lee's handwriting up close, you can get a chance to do that. Dr. Hopkins has applied his attention to detail as a surgeon to a thorough study of all 61 known Lee photographs. His book is a journey into the world of early photography. I've learned so much more about ambrotypes and daguerreotypes and so forth than I ever knew before. Certainly, photography was an exciting technology in the 19th century. Dr. Hopkins' knowledge and respect for Robert E. Lee comes through on every page of his book. Dr. Hopkins has also published papers in the medical field, as well as several important Civil War articles. He's the recipient of the UDC Jefferson Davis Historical Gold Medal. He also served as battalion surgeon for the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines in Vietnam. He was awarded the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star with Combat V. So please welcome Dr. Hopkins, surgeon, soldier, and scholar. Thank you, Dr. Hopkins.
Well, there's no question about it. This is a bit overwhelming. My wife, Cindy, and I expected to enjoy ourselves in Lexington, but not to receive the warm welcome we have. I must say I'm intimidated by the crowd, not the size, but the knowledge of history and Robert E. Lee and Robert E. Lee photographs out there. I'm sure before this is over, y'all will have taught me something. I hope that as I go through the presentation, I will be able to point out something that perhaps you haven't thought of, or maybe new knowledge for you. Some of this material it's actually been, I put a little more detail in this presentation than I did in certain aspects of the book. When you write a book of this nature, which was published in October of last year, things don't just stop then. You keep looking for things on that topic of Robert E. Lee photographs. You start getting calls from all over the country and folks emailing you different things. So there's no question I've picked up some new information even since the book was published. But I'm going to move through. Actually, there are two sections to what I'm going to do tonight, and I hope that you will enjoy it, and I expect you to ask your questions. Now, the first slide shows some of the modern day references for Robert E. Lee photographs. The one in the center by Roy Meredith is still considered the Bible, the go-to reference. It was published in 1947 has been reprinted several times, but I'm not sure much has been added to it as far as the photographs go. Roy Meredith had 36 illustrated from-life photographs of Robert E. Lee, meaning photographs when he actually sat before the camera and the wet plate negative was exposed. He did not have the advantage I did of the modern era of informational technology, so I'm not trying to at all disparage Roy Meredith or any of those who have studied Robert E. Lee work before. Again, I had an advantage of being able to probably see more material via internet and travel maybe than he did. This, of course, is my book. It came out in October, and since then, at that time, I had all 61 photographs that we knew of Lee, from life photographs. Since then, I've come up with at least 2 and maybe one other, but hopefully down the road we'll get a supplement. Now I want to take another look at some photographs y'all are all familiar with, but let's look at them through a different prism. These are the Matthew Brady, the subject is Matthew Brady and the antebellum photographs of Lee. If you read Meredith's study, you will see basically he credits Matthew Brady with making these 2 photographs. Now he's a little tentative when it comes to this photograph here of Robert E. Lee and his son. On the so-called West Point image, which was made approximately 10 years later, he's less tentative. He says this one was probably made by Matthew Brady, and also he equivocates a bit as to whether this is actually Lee and his son versus Lee's older brother, Sidney Smith Lee, and his son, Fitzhugh. Some scholars have questioned the possibility. And I want to talk about this photograph first. Let's look at a timeline that might relate to this photograph of Lee and his son. In 1841, then Captain Robert E. Lee began doing some engineering work at Fort Hamilton on the New York Harbor. At that time, shortly thereafter, his wife and family joined him in New York. In 1844, Matthew Brady opened his very first photographic gallery. In late 1845, Ms. Lee, then pregnant again, decided to go back to Arlington for her childbirth, so she took the children and went back. That left a fairly brief window, 1844, 1845, for Lee and his middle son, Rooney, who was about 8 years old at the time, to have this photograph made. So if Brady made it in New York, it was probably made during that window of time. Now, Meredith, again, he wasn't absolutely certain that it was Lee and his son. And he also admitted he had no firm evidence it was made by Brady, but he assumed that it was. And at the time he wrote his book in 1947, he said that the Virginia Historical Society had a copy of this photograph, but they would not, to use his word, vouch for it. Well, this is the description today at the Virginia Historical Society, and you can see they describe this as a black and white photographic copy of a daguerreotype of Robert E. Lee and son William Henry Fitzhugh Lee. Of course, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee's nickname was Rooney, to keep from getting confused with his cousin, who was similarly named. So apparently by now, the Virginia Historical Society had lost any reticence they might have had about the subjects. Now, some historians, including a friend of mine and very, very knowledgeable professor, Dr. John O'Brien, has felt for some time that this might be actually a photograph of Sidney Smith Lee and his son Fitzhugh. And there's reasons one would come to that conclusion. They both were very, very handsome men for the time, and they bore a very strong family resemblance. Now Sidney, and that is the way he correctly spelled his name, S-Y-D, was 4.5 years older than Robert, but they did have similar facial features. Of course, that's a subjective observation. And each of them had a son to be the proper age to represent this lad in the photograph. So I can see how the question came up. And if you try to compare photographs of Sidney Smith Lee with this particular photograph of Robert E. Lee, it's not easy to do because there are very few photographs of Sidney Smith Lee available. You see 3 over here, and then you see this one that we're discussing here, that there may be some question. Obviously these were taken from different angles, so it's very hard to compare all the facial features and all. My own personal opinion, and that's all it is, a subjective opinion, is there is enough difference in facial features to say that this man is a different man than those 3. But that still leaves it open to question. That led me, as this was after the book was published, to try to figure out a way to be more definitive about who it was. And I was fortunate in my research. I know y'all are all familiar with the book Robert E. Lee's youngest son published, a collection of Robert E. Lee letters, basically, with some commentary in between. Robert, it's been published and republished, and the recollection and letters of General Lee. This actually was published the first time in 1904. However, I found out that Leslie's weekly magazine, monthly magazine rather, actually started serializing this book in 1900. And the very first article in Leslie's had a copy of this daguerreotype that we're talking about. This is an actual picture of the illustration of the Leslie's page. And it does show the daguerreotype. The interesting thing, at the bottom under the citation for the picture, it says Robert E. Lee and his second son, W.H.F. Lee, in 1845 from a daguerreotype. That's plain as day. That's what Leslie's put underneath here, an article written by Robert E. Lee's youngest son. To me, that's pretty firm evidence that Robert E. Lee and his son were the subjects, because Robert E. Lee Jr. surely approved of this article to allow it to be published. He approved the photograph. 3 other Lee children, Robert E. Lee's children, were living at the time. None of them seemed to object. They seemed to accept the fact that this was indeed Robert E. Lee and his son. And Sidney Smith Lee's son, excuse me, I keep bumping that. Robert E. Lee, pardon me, Sidney Smith Lee's son Fitzhugh was still living, and he did not object. So I think that's good evidence that this was indeed Robert E. Lee and his son. Now, the question needs to be further studied as to who actually made this daguerreotype of Robert E. Lee and his son. Again, Meredith was not too convinced, but he concluded that Matthew Brady did it. This is simply a copy of a woodcut engraving of Matthew Brady's gallery, first gallery in New York, just as if they had appeared in a newspaper. Now, here are some facts that that seem to relate to this first daguerreotype. In 1845, the U.S. Army numbered no more than 10,000 officers and men. Captain Lee, who was of the engineers, of course, he was well known militarily within the small circle of engineers and the folks that he had graduated with from West Point, but he had not yet become extremely well known within the Army, and he had not done anything outside the Army to make him extremely notable. His fame came after the Mexican War, and that's important to note here. The other thing is that a daguerreotype, the type picture that these were, which is basically an image on a sheet of metal that's been coated with sensitized silver is a one-time positive image. There's no negative left for future reference. Now, Matthew Brady, in an interview in 1890 and 1894, another interview, did not have any recollection of making this photograph. And Roy Meredith made an issue of this. In a sense, he said that if Brady had recognized or had made this image, that he would remember it. Well, I disagree with that. Again, let's go through this. Lee was not yet famous. And Meredith, Matthew Brady would not have remembered him for the simple reason that Brady chose to involve himself only with the notables and the rich and famous that came into his gallery. And every citizen that could get a few dollars came to the gallery to have a photograph, and there's nothing that made him stand out, so it wouldn't have been remembered. My point being, Brady or one of his operators certainly could have made this picture. It was certainly Robert E. Lee and his son, and it was done in 1845. Now, let's move on to the West Point image. This photograph here that you see is actually a paper copy of the original daguerreotype. This paper copy was made by Michael Miley of Lexington after the war, probably from a prior paper copy made about the time the war started. Let's run through the timeline. Colonel Lee was assigned to Fort Carroll in Baltimore in 1848, and Matthew Brady opened a gallery in Washington in 1849. Lee was assigned superintendent of West Point to begin in September 1852. And of course he made several trips on military business from between Washington and Baltimore, which was less than half a day's train ride at the time. So this particular photograph could have been made in Baltimore, Washington, New York after he arrived at West Point even. It also could have been made in Virginia, for instance, Alexandria or Richmond, when General Lee was on leave. Roy Meredith in his study states definitively that this daguerreotype was made by Brady. He did not cite a reference, and definitely dates from 1850 or 1851, and that Lee is in civilian dress. Civilian dress. Well, actually, Colonel Lee was in uniform. And the uniform regulations for the U.S. Army changed in June of 1851. And over toward the end of the regulations, it had a privilege, a section describing what officers could wear off duty. And they were very explicit. It said the off-duty officers could wear a blue body coat, is what they termed it, a blue coat. The brass buttons on the coat could only indicate the corps or the regiment, but beyond the brass buttons and their insignia, there could be no other insignia on that coat. They could wear a vest, a waistcoat, which could either be white, buff, or blue. Staff officers could wear white or buff gloves. And this is most interesting. They could wear the new 1851 model visored cap. Well, this cap was somewhat of a cylinder, 6 to 7 inches tall, and with a visor. And at the base of it, it had a 2-inch wide ribbon going all the way around, which peaked in the front. Staff officers, this band was the same color as the cap. The buttons on the coat were arranged in a special way. The coat for a colonel, as Lee was a brevet colonel, were arranged in 2 rows of 7 buttons each, 3 inches apart. These items can be identified in this picture. See, the plain blue body coat with 2 rows of brass buttons evenly spaced, a light-colored vest, light-colored gloves. And as far as the cap goes, this is an illustration of the cap, 1851 model cap. Notice the band coming around and the peak in front. That's an actual photograph, a blow-up of a photograph of that cow. And what I'd always considered some kind of stain on his hat is the ribbon around it. There's no question about it. This is a uniform that was for only off-duty wear, and at least one other image of Winfred Scott Hancock as a young lieutenant wearing the same outfit. So he was indeed in uniform at the time this daguerreotype was made. This 1851 model cap was made regulation in the middle of 1851. By the time it was manufactured and procured and distributed, it was probably 1852 by the time Lee would have one to hold in his hand. And this cap remained in regulation until August of 1855. So therefore, this photograph was made between 1852 and 1855. Now, here's another interesting question. Did Colonel Lee violate Army regulations? Here was a man who went through all 4 years of West Point without a single demerit, okay? And he really was disliked by a lot of the cadets at West Point because he was too rigid with regulations. I mean, he stood by the regulations. And yet, here he is, over in this same set of regulations of June 1851. They didn't beat around the bush. Unless you were in the cavalry, you did not wear a mustache. Well, there's the man with a mustache. He also was holding the 1851 model hat. So the question is this. The 1851 model hat went out of regulation in August of 55. And Colonel Lee was appointed to the cavalry, as second in command of the 2nd Cavalry in the spring of 1855. So there was a brief window here in 1855 between spring and in August when the cap went out of regulation where he could have legitimately been wearing a mustache. You may can answer the question better than I. Did he violate the regulations, or was this photograph really made in the mid part of 1855? It certainly was made later than the 1850-51 that mirrored it. No. Now, going back to Matthew Brady as to who actually made the photograph. Brady, in some interviews in the late 1890s, and one of them he said he had known Lee since he was on General Scott's staff during the Mexican War. And in 1894, in another interview, he implied very strongly that Brady's first professional contact with Lee was when he made the famous backdoor photographs at the end of the war, with Lee in uniform. Lee was on General Scott's staff from mid-January 1847, went to Mexico, came back, remained on the staff until September of 88. In March of 1849, Brady opened his second studio in Washington, D.C., though he had been there in 1848 taking some photographs. So he was in and out of Washington. Lee, after being assigned to Fort Carroll in Baltimore, could easily have crossed paths with Brady, could have been acquainted with him, but there's absolutely no evidence that Brady made a photograph of Lee during this period that we're talking about. This is simply Matthew Brady's Washington studio, quite fancy, as presented by the Smithsonian Institute. Now, it's going to seem like I'm diverging from the subject here, but please bear with me. We're going to talk about another little group of photos that I hope will lead us around to actually identify who made this West Point daguerreotype. At the start of the war, there were there was quite a clamor for Robert E. Lee photographs. He was becoming well known. His name had been heard. And folks just wanted to know what this General Lee looked like, both north and south. The photographers and publishers took it upon themselves to artistically improve this West Point image by painting uniforms on it, and some of them more than others. As you could see, the one in the bottom corner fairly Spartan. The one by Brady over there got all sorts of fancy military uniform equipment on it. But anyway, there were several versions, but they were all based on this West Point photograph. They were not new photographs, and as many folks back then, and even up until almost now, would see these photographs and say, oh, these are Robert E. Lee in his Mexican War uniform. It's no such thing. The first of those altered photographs began to appear around Baltimore. Well, there were a couple of brothers, photographers, who had been raised in Richmond, actually trained in a studio in Richmond, and opened their studio from 1856 to 59 and taking photographs in Richmond. They moved to Baltimore in 1859. David and Daniel Bendan in their gallery actually produced two versions of this altered photograph. This one you see on the left hardly altered at all. They basically put a VA there in the peak of the ribbon and possibly brightened up the brass buttons a little. Their later version is much, much more fancy. The interesting thing about theirs is when they worked with this West Point daguerreotype, they must have had a pretty complete version, because of all of the altered photographs you see there show more of the cap, the gloved hand. Now, after the Bendan's version came out, or about that time, Matthew Brady, the photographer we've been talking about, he did his version. He altered his version, and it was much, much more extensive. The artist put epaulets and all this braid around the collar. And in fact, his was copied by a very famous engraving by A.H. Ritchie of Still Engraving. Between the two of those, they were used as a pattern for many, many woodcut engravings as time went on. Here we see the Brady alteration and the Ritchie engraving, which are virtually identical. When I say identical, if you look and see how the fringe on the epaulets hanging down, you're going to see the identical pattern in these two, the identical braid. So there was a definite relationship there. Ritchie probably copied Brady's photographic copy. Bendan brothers must have seen Brady's, and then they made their own more embellished copy over here. And the interesting thing about that, maybe they wanted to show theirs was different. Theirs was the very first one to show any evidence of a collar on the left side. See that little sliver? Now, if you notice, all of these woodcuts that were based on these photographs, woodcuts were made because they could be made rapidly and cheaply for the print, for magazines and newspapers, and in this circumstance for little small cards for folks to take these prints and put in their photographic albums. And one thing that happened, so many of these, when they were published, it would be a note on them that they were a photograph by Brady. Well, it was from a photograph by Brady, but it was that altered photograph, not the daguerreotype. Now, there's one such woodcut that may answer the question. I told you I would try to come in the circle here. This one, obviously it's laterally reversed, but it is based on the same series of photographs, all derived from the West Point daguerreotype. This was in the Southern Illustrated News. It was published in January of 1963. And as you can see, like two or three of these woodcuts, when they got printed, they printed his name wrong. Named his middle name Edmund. There were two or three publishers did that. The most interesting thing about all this is down at the bottom, tiny, tiny, tiny print, you can see from a photograph by Reeves taken some 10 years ago. Well, most historians have actually not paid attention to that, but some have noted it and totally discounted it, saying, oh, this was done by Meredith. Not by Meredith, by Brady. Now, the question that came to my mind, was it possible that this indeed was made, the daguerreotype was indeed made by the Reeves brothers? And now, who were the Reeves brothers? Charles and Edwin Reeves. They were in Richmond beginning in 1851 and worked throughout the war. At one point in the early 1850s, Charles went to New York. Remember, Lee was in New York at that point in time. The Richmond publisher of the paper gave credit to a photographer in the city, Reeves. And the news article that accompanied that woodcut, it said, "We present in this issue an engraving of this distinguished general, finished in Campbell's best style. The picture is from a photograph taken some 10 years ago. The only one we believe excellent of the distinguished chieftain." That to me is actually pretty clear. They had a photograph of Lee in hand that was taken 10 years ago. And there's absolutely no other contemporaneous statement that credits that daguerreotype to anyone. And Brady, again, never claimed it. Both Charles Reeves and Matthew Brady had galleries between 205 and 389 Broadway in New York during the early 1850s. So, in other words, it would have been just as easy when Lee went to West Point to go to either one of those two galleries. The attribution to Matthew Brady was given totally without reference by Meredith and has been carried together as fact till today. And Brady never had a recollection of taking it. Well, think about this. In 1850, Lee had become a hero. He was very much hero from his activities in the Mexican War. He had led the Marines that, he had become superintendent of West Point, and he was so well known in Washington that he attended 2 or 3 presidential receptions. So my point is, Matthew Brady probably would have given him personal attention had he walked in the gallery at that stage of his life. He denied, didn't ever take credit for it. So, this is a synopsis, basically, that these images were sought of Robert E. Lee at the first part of the war. That resulted in a lot of altered photographs based on the West Point image. Who made the first paper copy to be altered? In other words, to be distributed for these different photographers to alter? Well, one logical thought would be that if the Reeves brothers took the original daguerreotype, they had a studio in Richmond, why wouldn't the family who had the daguerreotype have them reproduce it? And that would lead to what we've just been through. The daguerreotype was actually made by Reeves, then later copied, and then the Bendam brothers, who were in Richmond at the time, just before moving to Baltimore, could easily have obtained a copy from which they made their first altered photographs and circulated them around Baltimore. The most powerful evidence seems to me, and a lot of it's based on this information from the Southern Illustrated News, that Charles or Edwin Reeves of either Richmond or Charles Reeves of New York made the daguerreotype, rather than Matthew Brady. Now, this is a totally separate section. I will try not to drag this out, but I think it's an important one. This I'm going through the Matthew Brady photographs that were made after General Lee was president of Washington College. According to Roy Meredith, and I'm going to quote here, the dates of many of the late pictures of General Lee are uncertain, but this date is clear. In early May of 1869, the face of Robert E. Lee again came before the camera. Again, the work was Brady's. 3 very fine portraits which follow with the results. Well, these 3 images are taken from Brady images in the Library of Congress. 3 classic images. The first one is the well-known clock image that I'm sure you've all seen. The other one in your left profile and this more straightforward view. Well, how in the world could it be that he assigned the date 69 to it when in March of 1866, just a month or so later, a woodcut print appeared in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, obviously based on the clock photo. Now, 1866, Meredith says 1869. There's no question that the picture was made before the print. Okay? So, that led to a very scholarly article by Dr. John O'Brien, who made it quite clear in a magazine article in 1986 that this photographic session when Lee was president of Washington, Lee occurred in February 1866, not May of 1869. Lee went to Washington in that February of 66 to a Senate hearing. He was subpoenaed, and he went to Washington, and that's when he actually had these photographs made. And to bolster that, some of these photographs have been seen with revenue stamps on them, which were only used on photographs up until August of 1866. And I won't get into the subject of revenue stamps and photographs, but that's an interesting topic in itself. But that again shows that they had to have been made before August of 1866 if they had revenue stamps on them. And many of these copies, in fact a couple of them out in the showcase, have copyright dates of Brady of 1866. Some even have cards stamped 1865 copyright on them, and that is probably because Brady, who was chronically in financial trouble, was just frugally using up his old 1865 cards. So there's absolutely no question this group of photographs by Brady were made in 1866, not 1869. Well, Meredith says 3 were made. Well, the 4th pose was recognized in 1983, and this one, it looks so similar when you first glance at it that you would say, oh, this is just the cropped torso portion from the clock portrait. Well, it's actually not. When you look very close, you can see differences in the position of the right end of his tie and configuration of the suit over the left shoulder. These are 2 different photos. This is a 4th photograph taken during that sitting. And all of a sudden up comes another one. This one was one identified in the same article by Dr. John O'Brien, and it has several subtle differences. One of the, from all of the others, one of the most obvious is the white shirt front. The triangle is much more of an isosceles triangle than the others, and here they are side by side. Are they really different photographs? Well, when you look at them side by side, the cropped clock pose by the other 2, you can see that there's definite differences. So at this point, we know 5 photographs were made at this sitting in 1866, not 3 as previously presented. And that was to end this presentation, except now, I more recently ran into a situation when I took the print of this photograph from the Library of Congress and placed it side by side with 2 CDVs that I thought were all the same photograph. Both they had Brady's copyright, and I thought they were the same until I saw them side by side. There's a definite difference in where the tie ends on the right side on all three of them. Well, that could have been done if they were made with a camera with multiple lenses, say 4 lenses. The difference in angle between the lenses can make little subtle changes. But if you look at them very carefully, and maybe not the best projection here, there's a difference in the wrinkles of the coat sleeve in some of these. So these are different poses. They're very minor differences. But here are 2 different poses that do not show up in my book. You've got some of these out in your case there. So now we've got 7 photographs made at this session when it started out with 3. Now here's the final thing I want to share with you. What I'm going to show you here is a virtually unknown portrait. There's probably 1 or 2 fellows in this. Seth Goodhart's probably seen this, but I had never seen it, and it's just a very impressive photograph. It was made in 1866 at this city, but the format is what's so interesting. In addition to being what was called a mammoth imperial photograph, meaning 20 by 24 size, which quite huge, and had to be done with a solar enlargement at the time. And it also, it looks like the clock portrait, doesn't it? Well, it's not the same clock portrait. This one shows Lee from head to toe, number 1. And again, it's mammoth imperial size. And it's also got, cannot make it out, it's got Brady's copyright notation with pencil, Brady and Washington, D.C. Now, actually the 4th portrait that we discovered earlier, it proved to be cropped from this particular portrait. We haven't seen the full portrait, we've only seen the cropped one, and not very many of those. Now, if you doubt this, look here. Here's the clock portrait that everyone's familiar with. Here's the full-length one. Look at the top of his shoulder on the left. See the difference? You may not can see the difference between where his sleeve relates to the base of the clock, but on this side there's a tiny separation between his sleeve and the corner of the base of the clock. That one, it covers that. Look at the relationship between the arm of the chair and his knee. No question those are different photographs. And interesting thing about the chair, by the way, you probably know that, but that was Abraham Lincoln's chair that gave it to Matthew Brady. It was his chair he used when he was in the Senate. That's the famous Lincoln chair that Brady used as a prop. So you got Lee sitting in Lincoln's chair. And not only that, you can tell anyone now that you have seen General Lee in spats. And if you don't know what spats are, you're going to have to ask your grandmother. Thank you. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I have a question and a comment. This is kind of interesting. First of all, do you know if Robert E. Lee, if there was a Robert E. Lee III? Do you know if there was?
I know nothing about him, but I've heard the name.
Okay, let me tell you, a friend of mine invited us to go to a Sons of Confederate Veterans, which we'd never gone to before. We said, sure, we'll go. So when I go in, the secretary gave me his card. His name was Robert E. Lee III. And I started talking to him. I said, you know, you might find this interesting, but my wife is a sixth cousin of Abraham Lincoln. And as soon as I told him that, he was almost offended. He wouldn't shake my wife's hand, and so forth. And I said later to my wife, I said, you know, if Robert E. Lee, the first one, if that would have happened, he would have shook her hand and probably greeted her and so forth and so on. So I've always been curious if there was a Robert E. Lee III in his genealogical line.
I have heard, I think there's more than one Robert E. Lee III, by the way. Okay. But I do not follow the genealogy. That's the most complex genealogy I've ever tried to get into.
Robert E. Lee IV he is or was the marketing manager after he quit his publishing job in San Francisco for the Bowman Brothers Virginia Gentleman Bourbon Company.
And he was in Robert E. Lee's line.
Yes, he's the fourth.
Yeah.
Robert E. Lee, I had met Robert E. Lee the fifth and Robert E. Lee the sixth. My question is, how could Robert E. Lee the third be alive?
That's what I would
Because
think.
Robert E. Lee
Because,
the fourth is in his 80s.
right. This guy, when I met this guy, he was
I don't know who
probably,
this was.
well, he's an imposter.
Or he was not.
Yes, sir.
You were there with the car.
Did you go back to side by side? Everybody out there.
With one.
But side by side, just like Robert E. Lee.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to know that. I feel better.
The other arm was very obvious.
Robert E. Lee the fifth
Chair.
is very
Yeah.
ferocious.
Was elbows bent?
Yeah,
That's the most obvious thing that I see. Isn't it?
yeah, there's lots of them. That I want to point out because when you look at them separately, they look like the same image.
Yeah, but his arm, you could see the whole
He has.
back of the chair in that
Yeah.
one, and then the other, his elbows over the top.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's different angles and full length. Yes, sir.
I thought you would explain why the 1859 portrait or something was perhaps the fellows in Richmond, but you were you thought the portrait with his son was most likely taken by Brady's gallery in New York, and I wondered what led you to that.
Well, first
there must have been many other photo galleries.
Yeah, I could find nothing. That was Brady's tentative attribution, and you're speaking of Lee and the son, and his son, and I could find nothing that said otherwise. And the only reason that Brady was tentative about it because he felt like that Brady would have remembered it. Well, at that point in Lee's career, there was nothing memorable about Lee as far as that would make Brady want to participate in it himself. And see, he had multiple so-called operators, photographers that worked his gallery. So it could have been done and he'd never know it because there was no negative kept in the file. No, that was strictly taken circumstantial of evidence of where Lee was at the time, where Brady was at the time, and I found nothing to alter the opinion on that one. Yes, sir.
So, I'm sorry.
Sir?
Yeah, I was going to ask, so, Ulysses Grant and the staff, there were pictures of Ulysses Grant and the staff out in the field. Were there any known photographs of Lee and the staff on the field during the war?
Well,
or were they just never relocated again if they hadn't taken them? They just know they never had been.
Well, that's an interesting question, and it is a topic of one of my presentations. As far as in the field, around tents and things like that, I don't know of any. But the so-called booted and spurred image, which is probably the first image made of Lee, showing him with his boots, his fancy sword, all in uniform. Meredith said that was done in a studio in Richmond, period, in 1863. Well, he didn't attribute any other photographs to that setting. That was kind of a tipping off situation. Maybe it was made elsewhere. But I don't have it here, but I can show that heavy uniform that he had on, the one that shows Lee with the buttons strapped under the lapel and all that, one buttoned and one unbuttoned. I'm convinced that the booted and spurred was made at the same time. All he had to do was take his binoculars off, and take his sword belt off, lay down his big hat, and sit down. And it was, I'm convinced it was made, quote, in the field at Lee's headquarters near Fredericksburg.
We have one display, the booted and spurred, and then one of the variant views of that out here.
Right.
Very
Well, in my opinion, and I express that in the book, if you follow the lapels on the booted and spurred, it looks like a butterfly out here, standing out, odd looking. Well, then the next one you see, the so-called unbuttoned coat, they're flat, but they're held by the buttons. And that looks a little odd if you look close. So the next one, he just buttoned the sucker up and he didn't have to fool with the lapel. And I think they were all three made at the same time. Yes, sir.
Have all the Michael Miley photos of General Lee been published?
As far as I know, in fact, I know of 3 for certain, and in my opinion, 2 more that Miley didn't take credit for them. He was given credit for them, and it stuck. In other words, at least 3 that Miley gets credit for he didn't take, and in my opinion, 2 others. But I know of none that were not published. I'd love to have one.
And was Miley's prime work from 65 to 70 with glass plates?
With what now?
With glass plate negatives?
Miley worked with glass plate negatives for sure.
I just wondered if there's, it was a big deal to take a photograph, and it's not like today where you take 4 or 5 and you publish one or prove one. Since most of the Miley plates are either W&L or Virginia Historical Society, it seems to me that they would have been published.
Well, they may have printed most of his plates. They have listed all of his plates having to do with Robert E. Lee and the Robert E. Lee family. And none of them are great giant size. The great majority of them are 8 by 10 or smaller. But yes, glass plate, I'm sure he probably made used other techniques too.
Do you know if that famous photo of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, where the Traveler Bar is now, there's a house, and it's been on front of some books. Did Brady do that one, or do you know?
The one on Traveler?
Well, it wasn't on Traveler, no. This house where Lee was in Richmond,
right.
They now have converted, I think, the upper part into a bar called the Traveler.
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know if that's Brady?
Brady made that set of photographs.
He did.
No question about it.
Yeah.
In fact, there was a newspaper article the day after he did it. He made those on the 20th of April, not Friday, not Good Friday, not Easter. It was a Wednesday or Thursday. And there was a newspaper article describing the photograph and saying he made 6 exposures. Brady later, in 1894, he was bragging, I think, but he claimed he made 12 exposures in something like 2 hours, which was unheard of. I don't know if he really made 12, but if he did, we need to get to looking for those other 6. Yes, sir.
Did Brady have other photographers working in his studios, or if he went to Washington, did he have to close them?
Oh no, sir. He had other photographers working, and some of them were more like mechanics. In other words, they operated the camera and so forth, and didn't do a lot of the artistic type work. But if I'm not mistaken, when Brady got married, he married a lady named Handy. They took off to Europe for about a year, and he exhibited some photographs over there. And he left, if I'm not mistaken, George Cook, the famous George Cook, in charge of the New York gallery. And Cook started sort of competing with him in his own gallery, and so he had to hasten back to Europe to, to protect his business. So he did employ other photographers, and they call them operators.
Could he take credit for what?
Always, you did.
Okay, so
that's what broke up.
Photograph, even though somebody else may have taken the picture.
Oh, hey, absolutely. That's the reason that he and Alexander Gardner, one of the reasons they split during the middle of the Civil War. Gardner was working for Brady and doing all these things in the field, and Timothy O'Sullivan and some other photographers. And Brady was getting all the credit, they thought. That what I think was just part of it. I think there were other business situations, but absolutely, if you owned the business, your name went on it. Yes, sir.
Out of curiosity, could you tell me the earliest known photograph, authentic photograph of Robert E. Lee, and how old he was in that photograph?
Well, the earliest known was one of the two daguerreotypes, and one.
The earliest.
Yes, sir.
So we have no photographs of him at the age of 15 or 20.
No, sir.
What was the daguerreotype invented?
What's that?
When was it invented, the daguerreotype?
Daguerreotype sometime in about 1840, and it was invented in France, and it was over here in a hurry. I think they were being commonly done here in the 1840s, early 1840s.
If there were, if Reese and Brady were within a block or two of each other in New York, it makes all the sense in the world that he would go to the photographer from Richmond.
Yeah.
Seems to me.
And the backdoor photos that were by Brady, my memory of that story is that Lee felt pretty put upon and did it because his wife kind of insisted. And she had a friend or a relative who was a friend of Brady.
That I don't know. I've heard 3 or 4 different stories of how that came about, but I do think his wife was the primary mover and shaker in getting him out on the porch.
Nothing then indicated, though, that Lee had had anything to do with Brady before. Lee would certainly have.
No. Now, Brady himself implied very strongly in 1894 that was his first professional contact, though he had known him since he was on Scott's staff during the Mexican War.
You mentioned that 2 of the photographs that look very similar might have been taken with 2 lenses at the same time. I'm not familiar with when they became popular, but when were those 3D type of pictures that people would look at through scopes come about? Didn't they do 2 lenses like that?
As far as I know, they started in the 1850s or something. Now, I'm sure there are people here that can correct me on that, but they were not uncommon. And the stereographic camera had 2 lenses spaced about 2.5 inches apart, which is about the distance between the human eye. And that's the reason when they took a picture simultaneously with that, they were getting it from that angle. And then when they were put in the holder to view it and move it till you get it in focus, and it would look 3D.
So did any of the ones you find have a little
I have not found a stereographic photograph that was made with a stereographic camera. Now, when you had 2 poses, or even the same pose, and put them side by side on a stereographic card, you could get some little effect by it. But I'm not certain, again, I could be corrected on this, I'm not certain that Lee had a photograph made with a stereographic camera. Any other? Okay. Thank you very much.